Well, before we get started, Madelyn and I, we wanted to do something. We wanted to, first of all, thank our very wonderful friend, Nagib. Nagib, would you please stand up? Please. Not only we cannot say no to this man because he's a great scholar, but every time we get a chance to participate in one of his conferences, we have always enjoyed it because he truly organizes conferences that are interdisciplinary, and every time we have had the opportunity to be a part of one of his conferences, we have learned so much from the audience because our work, as you can see from our own background, is truly interdisciplinary, and usually the type of questions we get in his conferences are excellent. It gave us always to think about new ideas, so we wanted to thank you. We really do appreciate your friendship. Okay, Madelyn?
Okay, so we're ready for the next slide. And what we begin talking about with our students is different approaches to ethics. I'm sure you're familiar with the universal approach, which says that everyone should be treated equally, that there shouldn't be any differences, the same standards are applied to everyone, no matter what. There are some obvious problems with this approach, because the biggest problem is who decides what the standards are, right? Who decides what is considered ethical and unethical? What is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad. So, again, as I mentioned a moment ago, a lot of times it's traditionally been from a Western perspective.
Right. And of course, each one of these approaches, they have their own advantages and shortcomings. For example, the universal approach is usually used at the general level. The United Nations whole notion of human rights, declaration, etc., is based on this notion of bringing people together and creating a much larger communities. But of course, as Madelyn mentioned, it's not without its challenges.
And of course, the relative approach says that no one from another culture can judge the actions of someone within that culture. So if you're outside the culture, you cannot comment on what people do within the culture. Of course, there's a problem with this too, because if we take this to the extreme, we can say, well, up to a point, no one in Nazi Germany complained about what was happening. They allowed that to happen. Apartheid was allowed to happen within that culture, right? So there are problems with this approach. Intercultural communication scholar Madelyn suggests what she calls contextual relativism. And this is taking each issue on a case-by-case basis. So we don't apply the same standards to everyone in a blanket way. We don't assume, however, that we can never get involved in what's going on in another culture. In a particular instance, in just one instance, if we have really studied the situation, and we understand the history, and we understand the society, we understand the culture, we know what's going on, then if we feel it's appropriate, we can take action. So this allows us to get involved without going into another culture and saying, well, we should do it this way. But when we see something like non-determinism happen, then we can say something.
Right. Okay. Go ahead. Right.
So, of course, in line with this is issues of social justice. And as I mentioned, when we teach our students, we're very concerned about the prevalence of a Western perspective. And one thing that we do in teaching students is we talk about research, because some research has been done where we look at another culture and we say, okay, well, let's see what's happening with these people in this culture or co-cultural group within a larger culture. And we study them and we interpret what's going on with them. Well, ideally, the approach should be one in which the participants in the research study are not viewed as subjects, but rather are viewed as equals, that they are taking an active part in the study themselves.
Okay. One of the things we like to emphasize is when we talked about the Western perspective is the dominance of that perspective. And that's not just, we are not talking about the superiority of ideas. We are talking about the West, for lack of a better term, has a much louder voice. something that is sometimes ignored, until it bites you in the back. And that the whole notion of, the soft power through places such as Hollywood, and most of the basically news coming through internet, etc., etc., that has a much louder voice. So that affects quite a bit of people, especially the younger folks. Every time we get an opportunity to travel overseas, we see how Western ideas, Western standards are becoming, especially among the younger people, becoming a standard. So this is kind of interesting and norm. Okay.
So one thing that we advocate is the decolonial approach to research. And this is an approach that really values the knowledge of indigenous people. And if you think about different approaches to intercultural communication research, this is very much aligned with the interpretive approach, which takes an ethnographic way of looking at research. And this comes out of anthropology, studies in anthropology, and sometimes maybe a participant observer kind of approach. So we go into the community, and I feel that the way these presentations were scheduled is really impressive, because a lot of what we're talking about builds on some of the points that Madelyn made so far, that you go into the community, you understand what's going on. You don't go in with the attitude that you're there to fix their problem. You go in and you learn and you become a member of the group, and only then can you really get involved.
Right, and of course we are not suggesting that this is a new approach. The decolonial approach goes all the way back to the post-World War II period. That, as you know, what happened during that period was the major colonial power, as a result of impact of World War II, they basically lost their colonies, and at the same time, in each one of those colonies, there was a sense of nationalism, independence. But the challenge at that time was many of these groups and places, they focused only on the political independence, to separate themselves as separate political units. And I think it took just about a decade or something to discover that just raising a flag and having your own national anthem doesn't necessarily mean you're truly independent. And they moved then after that, naturally they moved toward the whole notion of economic independence. And then they discovered very soon that way beyond economic ones, there are ideas, challenges, and everything else that it connects them to so-called mother countries. And that's how, that's the root of what we are talking about.
And in this type of research, it shouldn't be the agenda of the researcher that drives the research. It should really be addressing the social justice issues. The narrative approach is also valuable in that it gives people a voice who may not have been heard before. And this is often used in feminist research. And it gives people an opportunity to be heard. And in some cases, people feel that they have been overlooked, they have been passed over, they have been ignored, and now the research is focusing on allowing them to tell their stories and helping from their perspective. And let the researchers know how they think these issues should be.
Right, I agree, and especially when you focus on that one in terms of trying to make sure that the researcher is not projecting their own values. Every time we hear, because the world is shrinking every day. I'm sure all of you probably have heard about what happened, the massacre that happened this, earlier morning in New Zealand. Is that right? Somebody walks into a couple of different mosques and they have killed about 49 people, and there are tons of people who are seriously injured. So in terms of focusing on that, so it's sometimes it's very challenging for researchers to separate their own values from that. But that has been one of the parts that we have been trying to do. One of the issues we have tried to address in our research.
So again, these are just some of the other approaches, and obviously, as Houman mentioned, these are not necessarily new approaches. Active research has been around for a really long time, but these are the approaches that we want to foster and we want to instill in our students. The community-based approach, again, when you become involved involved in the community, and the solutions and ways to address issues comes out of the community and comes out of understanding of the community. And this goes along with contextual relativism, because in order to take a stand about an ethical issue, if you're taking the approach of contextual relativism, you will really learn a lot about the community. One example that we have used and used in our book is, and this goes back many years, but the whole, and sadly it's not over, but child labor goes on, unfortunately. But the issue that was very much in the news years ago about the children making the soccer balls and the night. And, you know, from a Western perspective, you might say, well, child labor should not be. We just have to stop that right away, and that's wrong. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't want to stop child labor, but what I'm saying is that people who had that attitude didn't understand was the money that those children were making was allowing their families not to starve to death. So obviously there's an emergency situation. We need to go in there and understand the whole situation and come up with a solution that addresses the fact that these people are at a substance level or on the verge of starving to death, not just the fact that we think from our Western perspective, you know, well, we've got to just wipe out child labor. And again, obviously we do want to wipe out child labor, but there's more to the story than just that one issue.
And please take another look at those, topics that we put over there. As you can see, none of these topics are basically what so-called are known as the mainstream approaches of like realism, liberalism, structuralism, etc. Because I think those ideas, they get tremendous amount of coverage. We have covered it actually in our work, but what we put over there are usually the ideas that are marginalized, minimized.
And so finally, what we're focusing on is the idea that this approach needs to become a way of life. It needs to be the way we do things. It needs to be an active practice. One example that is particularly relevant for my students who are studying technical communicators is, they may be working for a company that does not feel that it's important to caption the videos that they're creating. And just because that is not a priority for the company at that time, a lot of users may not be able to use those videos because they don't have captions. So from this perspective, we don't wait for the institution, for the corporation to say, okay, well now we're going to put the effort into captioning our videos. We would go ahead as a technical communicator and say, I'm going to find a way to do that now, because you can't wait for the institution to change. If you're taking this approach, you really have to take action now and do what you can.
Yeah, I agree. And the main point we are trying to make right here is passivity is not the answer. It's probably the easier way you're handling it, but what we are trying to do with our student is to try to empower them to be more actively involved and not to feel that, oh, they cannot make a difference, because that's one of the challenges of a lot of students. Usually, especially new topics, they feel very insecure and not so sure of themselves. But we have been able to, thank goodness, to actually empower a number of students who take our courses, take distance seriously, to actually make a difference. We have actually taught a number of courses, and a lot of our work comes not just at the matter of we isolate ourselves in our wonderful, research room in the library and just write about it. We actually have practiced this one in a number of courses that we have taught together.
So thank you very much. And again, thank you, Dr. Callis, for a wonderful conference every year. We really appreciate being here.
Thank you.